The first time my mother said it out loud, she didn't raise her voice. She smiled, not the kind of smile that comes from warmth, but the kind that settles into a room like it already knows it's right. "Buying a place isn't for people like you," she said, reaching for her glass as if she had just stated something practical, something obvious. The clink of silverware didn't stop. My father nodded once, slow and satisfied, like a point had been made and didn't need defending. My brother Eric leaned back in his chair, his arm draped casually over the backrest, while his wife Linda gave a small, knowing smile in my direction. No one asked me what I thought. They never did. We were sitting around my parents' dining table in Plano, the same dark wood table they'd had for 20 years. Sunday dinner, first of the month, the kind of routine that looks like stability from the outside. Inside, it felt like something else. I kept my eyes on my plate. I'd learned that if I stayed quiet, it ended faster. Across from me, my sister Rachel was already talking about a couple they knew who had just bought their second property. Something about interest rates and long-term equity. Brian, her husband, chimed in with numbers that sounded rehearsed. It always circled back to the same thing: houses, ownership, proof. Eric's looking at a second place, near Frisco, my dad added, cutting into his roast with deliberate precision. "Smart move. Get in before prices climb again." Eric shrugged, but he didn't hide the satisfaction. "It's nothing crazy, just making sure we're building something solid." "Unlike throwing money away every month," Linda said lightly, her tone soft enough to pass as harmless if you weren't paying attention. I was. I just didn't respond. At 32, I had become the example no one wanted to be. The one who lived downtown. The one who rented. The one who, according to my family, had never quite figured things out. My mother set her fork down gently, this time her eyes resting on me with something that looked almost like concern. "You've always been different, Lydia," she said. "More flexible. You don't really think long-term the way the others do." Flexible. It sounded better than unstable. I nodded slightly as if that settled it, because arguing never changed the outcome. It only made the room quieter in a different way. At the far end of the table, Sophie sat with her tablet, her legs swinging under her chair, as she worked through something for school. 9 years old, and the only person in the room who had never looked at me like I needed fixing. She didn't look up, not yet. The conversation kept moving around me, over me, like I was part of the furniture. Interest rates, mortgage strategies, property taxes, words that in this house carried more weight than anything I had ever tried to say. I let them talk. I let the labels settle where they always did. Because if I had learned anything sitting at this table, it was this. It didn't matter what was true. It mattered what they had already decided. And tonight, just like every other Sunday before it, they had already decided who I was. What they didn't know, what none of them had ever really stopped long enough to see, was that something small, something completely ordinary, was already sitting at the edge of this table, waiting. My father was the one who turned it into a lesson. He always did. "Property is the only thing that holds its value over time," he said, slicing another piece of roast as if the act itself carried authority. "Everything else comes and goes, but land stays." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. Everyone at the table already knew who the message was for. Eric leaned forward, slightly, picking up where my dad left off. "It's not even about owning a house anymore," he said. "It's about leverage. You buy, right? You let the asset grow. And suddenly, you're not just living, you're building." Linda nodded beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "We're looking at something near Frisco now," she added. "A second property. Rent one unit, live in the other. It just makes sense." Rachel smiled, the kind that came with quiet agreement. "Brian and I wish we'd done that earlier," she said. "We waited too long, and prices jumped. But at least we got in." Brian gave a small shrug. "You learn. That's what matters. You learn and adjust." The rhythm of it was familiar. One person spoke. Another reinforced. A third confirmed. By the time it reached the end of the table, It wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a system. I sat there, listening to it build itself again. Not aggressively, not loudly, just steadily. Like something that had been rehearsed enough times to feel natural. My mother picked her glass back up, watching the exchange with quiet approval. "It's not about showing off," she said. "It's about stability, about knowing you're secure." Her eyes flicked to me just briefly. Some people need that structure more than others. There it was again, not a direct accusation, just a placement, a way of deciding where I belonged without ever having to say it outright. I took a sip of water, letting the conversation move past me the way it always did, because there was a pattern to it. There always had been. Eric and Rachel didn't just talk about their choices. They represented something, proof that the system worked, proof that my parents had done something right. And I represented the alternative, the version of life that didn't fit neatly into the story they preferred to tell. Downtown living, renting, flexibility, words they tolerated but never respected. "Still in that apartment?" Brian asked casually, turning toward me, as if it had just occurred to him. "Yes," I said. He nodded, slow and thoughtful. "That area's gotten expensive. You're probably paying as much in rent as a mortgage would be." I didn't correct him. I didn't explain. Because I could already feel where the conversation would go if I did. "Well," my father added, setting his knife down, "some people value convenience over long-term thinking." It wasn't harsh. That was the thing. It never was. The tone stayed calm, measured, reasonable, which made it harder to push against, because nothing sounded like an attack, and yet every word carried weight. Across the table, Sophie shifted in her chair, her tablet lighting up her face as she scrolled through something. She wasn't listening to the conversation anymore. Or maybe she had never really been part of it. Her world was simpler. Questions had answers. Things either made sense or they didn't. There wasn't this quiet layering of judgment that disguised itself as advice. I watched her for a moment, the soft tapping of her fingers against the screen, cutting through the steady flow of mortgage strategies and investment timelines. Then I looked back at the table, at the way everyone seemed to settle into their roles without effort. My father, the authority. My mother, the quiet reinforcement. Eric and Rachel, the examples. And me, the exception that proved the rule. I let the silence hold where my response could have been, because correcting them wouldn't change what they believed. And explaining myself would only invite more questions that had already been answered in their minds. It was easier to let them be certain, easier to let them think they understood. But as the conversation circled, again interest rates, property taxes, future plans, I became aware of something small, shifting at the edge of it, not in their voices, not in their assumptions, but somewhere else, somewhere quieter. Sophie's tablet screen reflected faintly in the polished surface of the table. A building, tall, glass, familiar. And though no one else had noticed it yet, I felt something tighten in my chest. Because whatever she was looking at, it didn't belong in this conversation. Not yet. I didn't correct them. That was the part that would have been hardest for anyone outside this table to understand. It wasn't that I couldn't. It was that I had stopped trying. Because there had been a time, years ago now, when I did. When I thought sharing something real would shift how they saw me. It never did. 3 years earlier, I had mentioned landing my first hospital contract. Not in detail, just enough to explain why I'd be traveling more. My dad had nodded, distracted, then asked Eric about refinancing his mortgage. The conversation moved on. A year after that, I tried again. I told my mom I was expanding my work, bringing on people handling larger systems, things that required more responsibility than anything I'd done before. She smiled politely and asked if I'd thought about something more stable, something with benefits. I learned quickly what counted and what didn't. Numbers only mattered if they came attached to a house. Commitment only counted if it came with a mortgage. Everything else, everything I was building, stayed invisible. I sat at the table, now listening to the same language, wrap itself around me again, and let it settle. Because correcting them wouldn't just be a conversation. It would be a confrontation. And I wasn't interested in proving anything that way. Across from me, Sophie tilted her tablet slightly, the glow shifting across her face as she scrolled. I caught a glimpse of the screen again, without meaning to. The building was clearer now, 70-plus floors. Glass exterior. The curve of the balcony lines unmistakable if you knew what you were looking at. I did. I had stood there in person 3 months ago, signing documents in a quiet office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. No announcement, no photos, no celebration, just a pen, a set of keys, and a decision I made without telling anyone at this table. The purchase had been finalized under Monroe Data Systems, LLC, not for secrecy, for structure, for liability, for the same reasons my father had always talked about when he discussed doing things the right way. I almost smiled at that, but I didn't, because here at this table, that version of me didn't exist. "What are you working on, Soph?" my mother asked, her tone softening as she leaned slightly toward the end of the table. Sophie didn't look up right away. "Geography," she said. "We have to pick a building and explain why it's important." "That's a good assignment," Rachel said. "Real-world knowledge." Sophie nodded absently, still reading. "It has to be tall, and it has to have something special about it." Brian leaned forward just a little. "Plenty of those in Dallas now," he said. "Pick one of the new ones downtown. Those are the ones people talk about." I felt it before I decided to say anything. That quiet shift, the moment where I could either stay out of it or step into something small that didn't look like it mattered. "There's one near the Trinity," I said, my voice even. "Newer building, glass all the way up. Good views." Sophie glanced up at me, then interested. "Do you know the name?" I did. I had said it more than once over the past few months, in emails, in meetings, in documents that never reached anyone in this room. But here it felt different, like saying it would place something on the table that didn't belong yet. "Meridian Tower," I said. "Simple, neutral, just a suggestion." Sophie typed it in her fingers, quick-focused. "Okay, Meridian Tower, Dallas." The screen shifted, images loaded, angles I recognized instantly. But no one else was looking yet. The conversation around me continued. Interest rates closing, costs, long-term, planning uninterrupted, as if nothing had changed. And for a moment, nothing had. Not yet. Sophie's eyes scanned the page, her brow pulling together slightly in concentration. Then she paused, just for a second, the kind of pause that didn't mean anything, until it did. I should have stopped Sophie right then. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice. Just a light suggestion to pick a different building, a museum, a stadium, something safe. Instead, I sat there and listened to the scrape of silverware, the low hum of family voices, and the quiet tapping of her fingers against the tablet screen. Because part of me still believed I could keep the world separate, the one at this table and the one I had built without them. Sophie was still reading, her lips moving faintly, as her eyes tracked across the page. She had my brother Eric's dark hair and Linda's careful focus, but none of their need to perform certainty. At 9, she was still at the age where curiosity came before judgment. "What makes that one special?" Rachel asked, from farther down the table, more interested in filling the silence than in the answer itself. Sophie brightened a little. "It says it's one of the newest residential towers in Dallas. And there's a private observation deck on one of the upper floors. Residential," my father repeated with approval. "That's more useful than another office tower." My mother nodded. People who buy in buildings like that usually know exactly what they're doing. The irony moved through me so sharply I almost laughed. Instead, I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip, keeping my face neutral. Because this was how it always worked. They made statements about people like me without ever imagining I might already belong to the category they respected. The words changed over the years, but the structure never did. Responsible, stable, established. Those were the labels they handed to Eric and Rachel as naturally as passing bread across the table. And for me, there were different words. Flexible, creative, independent. Words that sounded generous until you heard the tone beneath them. Words that meant unproven, temporary, not serious. Sophie scrolled again. The glow from the screen reflected across the polished wood, briefly catching the stem of my mother's wine glass. "There are condos in it too," Sophie said. "Really expensive ones." Linda gave a soft laugh. "I'm sure." "No, like really expensive," Sophie repeated, still reading. Eric leaned back in his chair. "That's downtown for you. All glass, no yard, and they charge a fortune for the privilege." "It's not real ownership to me," my father said. "You pay that much and still share walls." "That's because you like land," Brian said, smiling. "I like permanence," my father corrected. Permanence. The word settled over the table like a verdict. I kept my eyes lowered, but I could feel my heartbeat beginning to change. Not fast, not panicked, just different. A tightening, a warning, because Sophie wasn't just browsing anymore. She was reading closely, the way children do when something surprises them. I knew that page. I knew how those building profiles were written: height, amenities, architectural firm, recent sales, notable units. I had read every public detail months earlier, trying to understand what remained visible after the closing. Very little I had thought, very little that could matter here. My mother reached for the serving spoon and added more carrots to my father's plate. "Lydia always liked the city," she said lightly, as if returning to a settled subject. "Some people need all that motion around them." I knew what that meant too. Not rooted, not settled, still drifting. I set my glass down carefully. At the far end of the table, Sophie went still again. Then she turned the tablet a fraction toward herself, squinting, as if checking that she had read something correctly. No one noticed. Not yet. But I did. And for the first time that night, it wasn't the conversation around me that made me feel cornered. It was the simple fact that a child doing homework at the edge of the table had wandered dangerously close to something I had spent years learning to protect. Sophie's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Can you help me understand this part?" she asked, still looking at the screen, her finger hovering over a section of text she hadn't fully processed yet. For a second, no one responded. Not because they weren't listening, because they didn't think it mattered. I knew better. I pushed my chair back, just slightly enough to lean toward her without drawing attention. "What does it say?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She tilted the tablet toward me. I didn't need to read it. I already knew what came next on pages like that. "Scroll down a little," I said quietly. She did. The section shifted. Price range. Amenities. Recent sales. The details were written in the same clean, detached tone I had seen before, numbers presented as facts stripped of context, stripped of the person behind them. "Whoa," Sophie whispered. That was enough. My mother glanced over. "What is it, honey?" Sophie hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she should interrupt. "It just says, some of the units cost more than $10 million, she said carefully. A small pause settled over the table. Not silence, but a shift. Eric gave a low chuckle. "That sounds about right for downtown luxury. Still doesn't make it practical," my father added. "You can spend that kind of money and still not own anything meaningful." I felt it then. Not the words, not even the judgment, but the certainty behind them. The way they spoke about people who lived in those buildings as if they were abstract, as if they existed somewhere far away from this table. From me, Sophie kept reading, her brow tightening slightly. "There's more," she said. Linda leaned in just a little. "Like what?" Sophie didn't answer right away. She was reading more slowly now, carefully, out loud, but only halfway, like she was testing the words before saying them fully. "Some of the top units," she began, then stopped. Her finger hovered again. I could see exactly where it was. The section that listed ownership structure. The kind of detail most people skipped. The kind of detail I had counted on being ignored. I could feel the moment stretching. This was where I usually stepped in. Redirected, smoothed it over, made it easier for everyone, including myself. I could still do that. I could suggest another building, laugh it off, shift the conversation back to something harmless. No one here was expecting anything different. That was the advantage of being underestimated. You were predictable, safe, contained. I looked at Sophie, at the way she was concentrating, not trying to expose anything, not trying to prove a point, just trying to understand what she was reading. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud before. I wasn't protecting them. I was protecting the version of myself they were comfortable with, the one that stayed quiet, the one that fit inside the limits they had already drawn. And for the first time, that didn't feel like patience. It felt like permission. Permission for them to keep deciding who I was. My hand rested lightly on the edge of the table. I didn't move it. I didn't interrupt. "Go ahead," I said to Sophie, my voice steady. "Read it." She nodded, taking that as encouragement rather than anything else. And just like that, the line I had spent years not crossing disappeared. Sophie took a breath, like she was about to read something important. "Some of the top units," she said slowly, "are owned through private companies." Her voice trailed just slightly, like the words didn't fully land yet. Eric didn't look up. "That's normal," he said. "People at that level don't put things in their own name." "Asset protection," Brian added, nodding. "Tax structure, liability, all that." My father gave a small, approving hum. "At least they're thinking ahead." Sophie kept going. "This one says, Monroe Data Systems, LLC. The words hung there for half a second, not long enough to register as anything serious, just long enough to exist. Linda blinked once, then gave a small laugh. "Well, that's a coincidence." Rachel smiled. "Monroe isn't exactly rare." Brian shrugged. "Probably no connection." The conversation tried to keep moving, tried to fold the detail into something harmless. But it didn't quite work, because even though they dismissed it, they had heard it. And once something was heard, it didn't disappear the way they expected it to. I didn't say anything. "Not yet." Sophie looked up from her tablet, her eyes moving between the adults, like she was checking if she'd said something wrong. "I just thought it was interesting," she said. "Same last name." "It is interesting," my mother said quickly, her tone smoothing the moment over. "But there are a lot of Monroes out there." She reached for her wine glass again, taking a small sip, like that settled it. Like that closed the subject. It didn't. I could feel it in the room. A shift, not loud, not obvious, but present. Eric leaned forward slightly, now, his attention no longer entirely on his plate. "What kind of company was it?" he asked, casual, but not entirely. Sophie looked back down. "It just says it's a data systems company." "Consulting?" Brian asked. "Probably," Eric said before Sophie could answer. "That's usually what those are." The certainty in his voice came too quickly, too easily. It wasn't about the answer. It was about control, about keeping things in a category that made sense to him, something manageable, something smaller. I watched him for a moment, the same way he had watched me earlier when he talked about leverage and ownership. Except now, for the first time that night, there was something else under it. Not doubt, not yet, but attention. And attention was where things started to change. Sophie scrolled again. "There's more," she said, her voice quieter now, more focused. I could see her finger pause just above the next section. Details, specifics, the kind that didn't leave as much room for interpretation. I felt the pressure build, not from them, not from the conversation, but from the simple fact that we were moving forward, and I had chosen not to stop it. That choice was still holding, still intact. No one was forcing this. No one was pushing. But I wasn't pulling it back either. And that difference mattered. My mother set her glass down. This time, her fingers lingering on the stem just a second longer than necessary. "What else does it say?" she asked, her voice calm, but sharper now. Sophie hesitated. Not because she didn't want to read it, because she could feel something changing. The room wasn't as easy anymore. The conversation wasn't flowing around her like before. It was waiting on her. I met her eyes briefly. Just enough. Just long enough. Then I nodded once. She looked back at the screen. And this time, when she read, everyone listened. Penthouse units. Sophie read, her voice steadier. Now are listed individually under ownership records. No one interrupted her this time. Not my father, not Eric, not even my mother. They were listening, not casually, carefully. Sophie scrolled a little more, then stopped again. "There's an example here," she said. "It says one of the units, Penthouse B, was purchased earlier this year." My heartbeat shifted again. Not faster, heavier. because I knew exactly where this was going. Go on, my father said, his voice controlled but no longer relaxed. Sophie nodded, reading slowly, making sure she got each word right. The owner is listed under Monroe Data Systems, LLC. That part had already landed. It had been dismissed, filed away as coincidence. But this was different. Located at 2718 Riverfront Drive, Penthouse B. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled. Heavy, specific, real. My mother was the first to move. Riverfront Drive. She repeated, her brows drawing together. Isn't that near where you said you live? Her eyes turned to me. Not accusing. Not yet, but searching. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have one. Because this was the moment everything shifted from assumption to verification. Yes, I said finally. Same area. Eric let out a short breath, almost a laugh. There are hundreds of buildings down there, he said quickly. That doesn't mean anything. Exactly, Linda added, her tone light but tight. It's just a coincidence. Rachel nodded too fast. And Monroe Data Systems. That could be anyone. It's not like Lydia runs some big company. There it was. The line they held onto. The version of me they understood. Small, contained, consistent. Sophie looked between them, then back at the screen. There's pictures, she said, of the penthouse. No need for that, my father said, a little sharper now. We don't need to get distracted. But Sophie had already tapped the image. The screen brightened, floor-to-ceiling windows, a wide terrace overlooking the Trinity River, clean lines, open space, the kind of place they had been talking about all night, as if it belonged to someone else. Linda leaned in despite herself. Wow, she said softly. That's over the top. Eric cut in. No one needs that much space. Brian didn't say anything. He was looking at the screen longer than the others, then at me. Just for a second. My mother reached for her phone, slowly this time, deliberately. What was the address again, she asked. Sophie repeated it, every word. Clear. My mother typed it in her thumb, hesitating once before pressing search. The room shifted. Not loudly, but completely. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a check, a confirmation, something that could either disappear or not. Eric leaned back, folding his arms. You're not seriously thinking. I'm just curious, my mother said, cutting him off, her eyes fixed on the screen. The results loaded. I watched her face change, not dramatically, but in stages. Curiosity, confusion, stillness. She didn't speak right away. Her fork slipped slightly against her plate, the faint sound sharper than anything anyone had said all night. What Rachel asked. What does it say? My mother didn't answer her. She was still looking, still reading, as if saying it out loud would make it real in a way she wasn't ready for. And for the first time since this started, no one tried to explain it away. No one filled the silence, because whatever was on that screen wasn't something they could control anymore. My mother's phone was still in her hand. She didn't lower it, didn't pass it to anyone else. She just kept staring, like if she looked long enough, the information might rearrange itself into something more acceptable. That's not right, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question. It was a correction, or an attempt at one. Eric leaned forward. What does it say? He asked. She hesitated, then turned the screen just enough for him to see. I watched his expression change in real time. Not shock, not disbelief. Calculation. He read quickly, his eyes scanning for something, anything that could invalidate what was in front of him. That doesn't prove anything, he said almost immediately. It's just a record. Anyone can set up an LLC. Brian shifted in his seat. Let me see. The phone passed hands, from Eric to Brian, from Brian to Rachel, each of them reacting in their own way, but all following the same pattern. Look, process, reject. Maybe it's a different Lydia Monroe, Rachel said, her voice a little too fast. It doesn't say. It says enough, Brian cut in quietly, still looking at the screen. That was the first crack. Small, but real. Linda leaned closer to Eric, her voice low. What's the purchase date? She asked. Eric scrolled. 3 months ago. 3 months. Exactly. The timing lined up too cleanly to ignore. My father hadn't moved. He was still sitting upright, his hands folded in front of him, as if he were waiting for the conversation to settle back into something he recognized. "What else does it say?" he asked. Not to anyone in particular. Just into the room. Rachel swallowed. "It lists the owner as Lydia Monroe," she said slowly. "Full name, my name, spoken out loud in a different context for the first time. Not as a comparison, not as an example. As a fact." My mother finally lowered the phone, placing it carefully beside her plate. Her fork rested against the edge untouched. "You've been living near there," she said, her voice measured now. "For how long?" There it was. Not an accusation. Not yet. A question framed as clarification. A chance, if I wanted it to explain everything away, to step back, to soften the edges of what they were starting to see. I could have said it wasn't mine, that it was a client's property, that I had been involved in the purchase in some indirect way. There were a dozen ways to redirect this, all of them easy, all of them safe. I looked at the phone on the table, at the reflection of the overhead light across its screen, at the way every answer they were searching for was already there, not hidden, not complicated, just ignored until now. "No," I said. Just that, one word, not defensive, not explained. And for the first time that night, the room didn't rush to fill the silence, because that answer didn't close anything. It opened it. Eric leaned back again, but this time it wasn't casual. It was distance. "Then what are you saying?" he asked. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because I understood something and that I hadn't before. This wasn't about convincing them. It never had been. The system they trusted, records ownership documentation, was already doing that. All I had to do was stop interrupting it. No one touched their food after that. The roast sat cooling in the middle of the table, the serving dishes still half full, the candles my mother insisted on lighting every first Sunday, burning lower between us. It should have felt domestic, familiar. Instead, it felt like something had split open. My father was the first to speak again. "If that record is yours," he said carefully, "then why would you let us go on thinking you were renting some little apartment downtown?" There was strain in his voice now, but also something else. Not humility. Not yet. A need to recover ground. To turn this into a misunderstanding instead of what it really was. I looked at him across the dark wood table he had ruled for as long as I could remember. "I never told you I was struggling," I said. "I just stopped correcting you." Rachel let out a small breath, almost offended by the distinction. "Lydia, come on. If you bought a place like that, why keep it a secret?" Because you never asked with curiosity, I thought. Only with judgment. But I didn't say it that way. Because every time I mentioned work, I said, it got translated into something smaller. Eric leaned forward, his forearms on the table. Nobody translated anything. "You made it sound vague. Data systems, downtown flexible schedule." That could mean anything. There it was. The defense. Not that they had been wrong. That I had failed to present myself correctly enough to deserve being understood. Brian looked down at his plate, then back at me. He was still the quietest one at the table, but he wasn't looking away anymore. "What exactly do you do?" he asked. The room stilled around the question. Not because they didn't know the words, because for the first time, they were asking them without already assuming the answer. "I design data security infrastructure," I said. "Mostly for health systems and financial networks. My firm handles architecture monitoring and breach response planning." My mother blinked. "Your firm?" "Yes." "How many people?" Brian asked. 32. That landed harder than I expected. Linda's face changed first, then Rachel's. Eric sat back slowly, as if distance might help him rearrange what he was hearing. My father frowned. "Since when?" "Long enough," I said. That wasn't cruel. It was precise. My mother reached for her phone again, not to question me this time, but to search. Her thumb moved quickly, then stopped. Her expression shifted as she read. "There are articles," she said quietly. No one answered. She kept scrolling. One from Dallas Business Journal. Another from Healthcare Systems Review. Her voice thinned. "Lydia Monroe, founder of Monroe Data Systems." Hearing my name spoken that way in this house felt stranger than I'd expected. Not because it wasn't true, because it had always been true, and none of them had made room for it. Eric gave a short shake of his head. Why didn't you just say this? I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was the easiest question in the world, for someone who had never really listened. I did, I said, just not in a way you respected. That finally did it. Not the ownership record, not the articles. That sentence, because it placed the failure where it belonged, not in my silence, in their hearing. My father's jaw tightened. My mother looked down. Rachel folded her napkin once, then again, her movements neat and useless. Eric said nothing, and in that silence, I felt it happen. Not forgiveness, not relief, just the clear, undeniable shift of power. They were no longer deciding who I was. They were reacting to it. At the end of the table, Sophie looked from one face to another, not fully understanding the history, but understanding enough to know the room had changed. So Aunt Lydia really owns the big apartment, she asked softly. Penthouse, I almost said, but I let the word stay where it was. Yes, I said, and no one at the table corrected me. 3 weeks later, they came to my place for dinner. Not because anyone said that would fix something. Not because the air had cleared. Just because after a silence like that, somebody had to decide what happened next. For once it was me. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse foyer, quiet and warm, under recessed lighting. Beyond it, the glass walls caught the late evening skyline, the Trinity River, reflecting silver beneath the city lights. The space no longer looked like listing photos on a screen. It looked lived in, chosen, finished. Sophie stepped out first and stopped in the middle of the entryway with both hands pressed to her cheeks. Aunt Lydia, she whispered, this is amazing. I smiled then. Not because I needed anyone's reaction, but because hers was the only one that felt untouched by performance. The adults entered more slowly. My mother looked around with careful restraint, as if admiration might still be mistaken for surrender. My father stood a little too straight, his hands in his jacket pockets, studying the room the way he used to study floor plans and mortgage rates. Eric and Rachel were quieter than I had ever seen them. Linda and Brian followed with the same polite caution. People bring into spaces they suddenly understand they misjudged. I had set the table near the windows. Simple linens, warm food, no statement pieces, no attempt to impress. Just dinner. That was the point. I wasn't interested in making them feel small. I was interested in no longer allowing them to make me feel that way. Conversation started carefully. Work, traffic, Sophie's school project, now turned in and apparently praised by her teacher for excellent real-world detail. That made Sophie glow. It made the rest of us smile, even if some smiles were easier than others. Halfway through dinner, my mother set her fork down. This is beautiful, she said, and for a second, no one moved. Not just the apartment, the life you built. There it was. Not a perfect apology, not a dramatic confession, but the first sentence from her that didn't reduce me. My father looked at me across the table. I was wrong, he said. The words sounded unfamiliar in his voice. I kept measuring success by what I understood. That wasn't fair to you. Eric didn't say much at first. When he finally did, it came out low. I thought I knew what responsibility looked like. He glanced around once, then back at his plate. I didn't know anything about your life. Rachel exhaled softly. We made you into a story that made us comfortable. That one stayed with me, because it was true. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had arranged me, placed me where I was useful to their version of the family. And now that version was gone. The loss of it was their consequence. Not public humiliation, not revenge in the loud sense, just the permanent end of a lie they had been allowed to live inside. I rested my hand beside my glass and let the silence sit long enough to matter. I'm not angry in the same way anymore, I said. But I'm also not going back to how things were. No one argued. That was part of the justice too. No negotiation, no minimizing, no one telling me I was too sensitive, too private, too difficult to understand. Just acceptance, real if late. After dinner, Sophie asked if I would show her the view from the terrace. We stepped outside together, the night air cool against our faces. The city spread out below us in quiet lines of light. She slipped her hand into mine. "I liked your old apartment too," she said seriously. "But this feels more like you." I looked out over the river and laughed softly. "Yeah," I said. "I think it does." When everyone left that night, the penthouse was quiet again. Not empty, not lonely, just mine. That was the healing I hadn't known to ask for. Not their approval, not even their regret. Just the right to stand inside my own life without translating it for anyone else. If you've ever been misunderstood by the people who were supposed to know you best, I'd love to hear what that looked like for you. If this story stayed with you, like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next one. Sometimes the next story starts where silence finally ends.